Hello lovelies, in this video we're going to be going through our second GCSE English language paper 1. So this is the second paper that we've written for you. We are going to take you through all of the 5 questions. We're going to show you how to prepare to go through, what you should be doing at the beginning of the paper, and how you can mark your answers as you're going along so you can see what sort of things level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4 answers are going to be, and make sure you're hitting all of those marks in the exam.
Hello everyone, today we're going to be completing an English language paper 1 for GCSE. This is practice set 2, so there is another one if you would like to go and watch that one. You don't have to do that in any particular order, but just so you know there are more examples as well. Now in this paper you will get 1 hour and 45 minutes. Obviously we're going to go through it bit by bit, so it might be a little bit longer than that, and it will be broken down into 2 sections, section A and section B. Now in section A there are 4 questions where you answer questions analysing the text that you are given, and then in section B, that's all down to you. You are writing your own descriptive piece or narrative piece. Now I'm just going to show you really quickly how that breaks down in terms of time, and I would note these down just so you have a good idea of how long to spend on each section. So first and foremost, you want to spend an hour on section A. Now the hour includes 15 minutes of reading time, and it says that just underneath there, and 45 minutes answering the questions. So you want to time those, and I will tell you as we go through how much to split up those questions as well. And then in section B you've got 1 question and you want to spend 45 minutes on that one alone, and that is because that one is worth 40 marks on its own, and in section A all 4 of those questions are worth 40 marks altogether. So in total the paper is worth 80 marks. What we're going to do is have a look through the assessment objectives, a look through the questions, and then we'll have a read of the extract. So what I wanted to do first was just show the assessment objectives to you, just so you knew what you are aiming for as you are going through this paper. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is cross off AO3 because we do not need to worry about that one. You'll see on the right hand side there it says not applicable, so we can cross that one off. We only need to worry about AO3 when we are looking at paper 2, so let's scribble that out. Now if we just take a quick look at AO1, the bullet points say I can identify explicit and implicit information from the text, I can interpret explicit and implicit ideas from the text, I can select facts from the texts, and I can combine evidence from texts. So essentially all it's asking you to do to achieve marks in AO1 is identify quotations and references from the text and be able to just kind of understand and comprehend them. So it's a really easy one, it's just essentially comprehension and quotations. Okay, so looking at AO2, got 4 bullet points there. First one says, I can explain how writers use language and structure to achieve effects and influence readers. So in other words, you're considering the use of any kind of interesting choice of words, any interesting choice of structure, in other words, how it's put together, and how that kind of creates meaning for readers and how it affects them as well. You've got I can comment on how they are used to achieve effects, it kind of builds on that. I can analyse how writers use language, so you go really deep with those ideas, zooming in on features that you spot, and then I can use appropriate subject terminology, so identifying the actual names of methods that are being used as well. And then finally you've got AO4, which is I can evaluate text critically and support this with relevant textual references. So AO4 only really applies to question 4, where you evaluate. Now if you evaluate, you weigh up your evidence to come to a conclusion, and it says there you support it with relevant textual references, so you support that with the evidence from the text. Again, in other words, that's quotations. Now in section A there are 4 AOs, 3 that apply to paper 1, that's 1, 2 and 4. So all of those form the first 40 marks of the paper where you answer the questions on the text that you are provided. And then in section B there are 2 AOs for 1 question to again form 40 marks. So you can get marks in 2 different ways for the one big writing question that you do towards the end of the paper. Now AO5 is worth 24 and AO6 is worth 16, and in AO5 you are essentially gaining marks for the things that you say and the way that you put your text together. So the way it's structured, the language that you use, the vocabulary that you use, the communication being really sort of clear and engaging. And then looking at AO6, 60 marks for that. The vocabulary that you use, again, so you kind of double marked for that, which is really nice if you are really, really good with your vocabulary. Using sentences that are really clear and you're using them for purpose and you're creating an effect with those. So you're varying them and you know how to vary them. And then your spelling and punctuation is accurate as well. So you can get 60 marks essentially for your SPAG. And it's really important that you try and focus on varying your vocabulary, your punctuation, your sentences as well. So next thing we're going to do is have a look at the questions, just so you've got a sort of a sneak preview before we read the extract. Now the reason why I'm showing you the questions first is because I would always recommend just having a little bit of a sneak peek before you read the extract for the first time. And the reason for that is just because then you know what you are looking for in the extract. So it would be just, I suppose, a time-saving hack for you to help out under those kind of heavy time constraints that you've got. So let's just look at section A's questions first. Now, you've got question 1, really easy one. You're going to be asked to look at lines 1 to 6, listing 4 things about the man. Now this is the really, really easy question where AO1 comes into effect, where you just read the extract and understand it. So this is very much comprehension. Now, looking at the next question, you are again asked to look at lines 1 to 6. It's really important that you take note of that or highlight that, because if you choose references from outside of those line numbers, then you will not be marked for that. So please make sure you stick to what you are told to stick to. In this question, it says, how does the writer use language in these lines to describe the man? And you can look out for words and phrases that are used and language devices. Now, third bullet point says sentence forms. This one's a little bit more tricky, but we can take a look at how that affects use as well. But sometimes we don't want to end up getting confused with structural analysis, which can really kind of come into effect when we're talking about sentence forms as well. So it's one to kind of look out for. That one's worth 8 marks. Looking at the next question, this is a structure question, and it says you need to refer to the whole of source A, so the whole of the extract. There's no line numbers here for you to worry about. And it says, how does the writer structure the text to interest you as a reader? So you can write about things that the writer focuses on at the beginning, how this changes as the extract continues, and then any other structural features that interest you. And this one again is worth 8 marks. So when we talk about structure, we're talking about the way that the text is built, anything that changes, anything that the writer lingers on or deliberately spends a long time focusing on, any kind of change in time, any change in dialogue, character, setting, that's all structural, contrast and juxtaposition as well. So there's lots to look out for that one. And then finally, if we look at question 4, you are asked to look again at line 7 to the end of the extract. And in this question, you will always get a statement that you essentially come to a conclusion on. So this is where the evaluation skill comes in, AO4. And it says the writer makes us sympathise with Pip as he is clearly in an intimidating situation. And it says, to what extent do you agree with that student? So you want to be looking out for things that make us feel sorry for the character Pip that we'll look at, because he's in an intimidating situation. So there's almost 2 things to look out for there. You write about your own impressions of that situation or character, depending on the statement you're given. You evaluate how the writer has created these impressions, and you obviously support it with references to the text as well. So those quotations and pieces of evidence that you have to decide whether you agree or disagree. Now this one's worth 20 marks. Okay, so that is the whole of section A. Let's just quickly have a look at section B, that one question that's worth 40 marks. Okay, so it's less crucial that you look at this very, very early on, because obviously you don't necessarily need the extract to be able to answer this question. What I would say is that in this question, sometimes there can be some inspiration from the extract because they tend to be thematically linked. So here, I'm just going to really quickly show you it on that basis. You are asked to spend 45 minutes on this question again, just to remind you, and it'll always give you a bit of a scenario. So you are going to enter a creative writing competition. Either, there's 2 options here, write a description suggested by this picture here, or you're going to write a story about a time where you felt afraid. Now there are always 2 options for you to choose from, and you can choose the one which you feel most comfortable with. It might be that the extract inspires you with one of those in particular, and you'll see potentially when we read, or hopefully when we read, how these can be kind of connected with the extract as well, these questions. So let's have a little read of the extract, and we can start to kind of make a plan based on our questions that we've got. Now, when you read it for the first time, I would personally recommend reading it twice. Don't forget you've got about 15 minutes of kind of reading time, and they tend to be a little bit longer in the exam than what we've got here. So read it twice, reading it once, the first time just to get a feel for the extract. You might start picking up some ideas as well because you've already read the questions, and then reading it a second time and really starting to kind of highlight anything that stands out to you as well and make some really brief notes. Now at the top you'll always get a summary of the extract that you are given, just to give you a little bit of context behind what is actually going on and what to expect. So it says the source is taken from near the beginning of the novel Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. It said that on the front. And in this extract, an orphaned boy called Pip has travelled to the nearby graveyard to visit his parents' and siblings' graves when an escaped prisoner approaches him. So it's useful to know that he's in quite a vulnerable situation for when we read this extract as well, because not only is he in a graveyard, which presumably would be very quiet and eerie anyway, someone potentially dangerous approaches him. So let's have a little read. It starts off with a fearful man, all in coarse grey, with a great iron on his leg. A man with no hat and with broken shoes and with an old rag tied round his head. A man who had been soaked in water and smothered in mud and lamed by stones and cut by flints and stung by nettles and torn by briars, who limped and shivered and glared and growled, and whose teeth chattered in his head as he seized me by the chin. "Oh, don't cut my throat, sir," I pleaded in terror. "Pray don't do it, sir." "Tell us your name," said the man. "Quick." "Pip, sir." "Once more," said the man, staring at me. "Give it mouth." "Pip, Pip, sir." "Show us where you live," said the man. "Point out the place." I pointed to where our village lay, on the flat inshore among the alder trees and pollards, a mile or more from the church. The man, after looking at me for a moment, turned me upside down and emptied my pockets. There was nothing in them but a piece of bread. When the church came to itself, for he was so sudden and strong that he made it go head over heels before me, I saw the steeple under my feet. When the church came to itself, I say, I was seated on a high tombstone, trembling, while he ate the bread ravenously. Now what I'm going to quickly do is just mark out exactly where we were asked to kind of look for our questions. So in question 1 and 2 we were asked to look at lines 1 to 6. So just marking that out, that's what we have to focus on for lines 1 to 6. Question 3 was of course the whole of the text, and then question 4 was looking at line 7 to the end. So just marking those out so I know exactly where to take my evidence from when I'm answering these questions. Now looking back for a second time, again you would read it in full. I'm just going to quickly summarise this and identify some of the key things that I noticed as I was reading. With question 2 we were asked to focus on the use of language that is used by the writer to describe the man. So in that first paragraph there, lines 1 to 6, you get a real sense of the man's or the prisoner's mannerisms. It's quite a vivid description of his clothes, and there's a lot of violent verbs that are used as well to show his aggression, but then also his vulnerability. So yes, he comes across as quite dangerous. He seems to be trying to antagonise Pip in some way further down, but we've got quite a varied description of the fact that he is aggressive but vulnerable. And that is clear in words like limped and shivered and his teeth chattered. So clearly he's really struggling with the cold. He's dirty, he's smothered in mud, but he's all in coarse grey, which reveals his kind of prison uniform as well. But then you've got language like seized, that he grabs him by the chin and grabs him by the face. Now what's interesting is there are actually quite a lot of verbs that show him to be vulnerable, even in defence of kind of the effects of nature as well. So we've got words like lamed, cut, stung, torn, all by natural things. So it shows weirdly that this prisoner is more of a victim than a villain. So that's something worth just keeping in mind for question 2 when we're looking at language as well. Now, just as we're thinking about question 3 and 4, obviously throughout this extract, worry is for Pip, but then it kind of transfers over to this prisoner because you actually realise by the end he's really hungry. So that's something to keep in mind with question 3, just how the text progresses and how we realise that potentially this man isn't as intimidating or as threatening as we first thought. Forget with question 4 as well, we were asked about our sympathy and how that lies with Pip because he's in a intimidating situation. So we can kind of look at that one, and this one's quite a nice question because you can kind of argue for both sides I think here, because we definitely worry for Pip, or he's pleading in terror for example, but then we realise by the end actually, like we said, that the man is ravenously hungry, so maybe it kind of shifts from Pip to this prisoner. So that's something worth just keeping in mind as we work through these questions. Now you'll see that when I've read through this for the second time, or just kind of skimmed through it for the second time in this case, I've tried to to do that with those questions in mind. So that is what I would recommend doing for you as well. Okay, don't forget, for this question we are being asked to look at lines 1 to 6, listing 4 things about the man. So this is a nice easy question. We want to spend about 5 minutes on it, and we are just really simply looking for 4 things from the text about the man. So it doesn't have to be analytical. You don't have to kind of imply anything here. You can quite literally just pick out key facts from the text. So for example, we might write down the man is wearing all grey. The next one I might write down is that the man has a piece of iron on his leg. We also learn that the man has an old rag tied to his head. And I can also write down that the man growled, for example. Now you'll see that none of these are particularly complicated. We are just writing down what we can see. There are plenty of others that you could have written down as well, so long as you are stating something that you learn about that man. There are loads and loads. You can split them up as well. So for example, where it says he glared and growled, make that 2 instead of 1. Split those up into 2 marks. Now, the last thing I would say is, did say you could spend 5 minutes on this question, but it's such a quick one, it might be a way to make up some time for the rest of the paper as well. It's a very quick question. Okay, so just as a reminder of this question, we are looking at lines 1 to 6 for 8 marks, and this is our language analysis question. So it's worth 8 marks, and I would recommend spending around 10 minutes on this one. Now you'll be able to see the mark scheme there as well. You have got 4 levels for this, as with all the other questions, and at the top, that's what we're aiming for. All the models are of a level 4 standard, so it's best we look at that. You have bullet point 1, analyses the effect of the author's language selection. So essentially what we're doing is making sure that we can comment on the choice of language that the writer has used and the impact and imagery it provides to readers like ourselves. The second bullet point says, chooses a well-considered variety of textual details. Again, that's just quotations. And third, it says utilises advanced and precise subject-related terminology. So really showing off what you've learned in English, the methods that you know, whether that be similes, metaphors, verbs, the types of lists that are used as well. So let's have a look at the question and the extract in more detail to plan on the next slide. Okay, so I'm quickly just going to reread this extract just so we can answer that question and look for our plan on how the writer uses language to describe this man. So, a fearful man, all in coarse grey with a great iron on his leg, a man with no hat and with broken shoes and with an old rag tied around his head, a man who had been soaked in water and smothered in mud and lamed by stones and cut by flints and stung by nettles and torn by briars, who limped and shivered and glared and growled and whose teeth chattered in his head as he seized me by the chin. Thing that struck me first was just in that very first line, actually, where it says a fearful man all in coarse grey. When we're thinking about this man, we know obviously that he is a prisoner, an escaped one at that, and the fact he's wearing his prison uniform, this coarse grey uniform, we can look at that word all first and foremost. I want to go down the idea that it kind of makes it sound like he's been stripped of his true identity. All he is a prisoner now. There's nothing left of the man he once was. He's all in this coarse grey, that's all he is. So much so that it's almost like the prison system's kind of stripped him of his identity completely. And you've got the word coarse there, meaning sort of poor quality. With that section, I kind of want to consider the idea that prisoners typically are kind of considered worthless and almost like a burden on society. It maybe potentially create sympathy for him because we realise the hardships he's facing, obviously supported by some of the language used later on in this section as well. It's not an easy ride for him at all. There are clear hardships faced in prison. He can't even wear comfortable clothes there. Now, as we look a bit further on, we learn that he has a great iron on his leg, so in other words, he is shackled. There could be sort of 2 different interpretations for this. Now, literally, iron is obviously quite heavy metal, so 2 ways we could see it. He is kind of metaphorically weighed down by his crimes and the things that he has done, or his punishment equally. But then also, just more simply, I suppose, it's a reminder that he is potentially dangerous, the fact that he is shackled as well. Now, with that in mind, obviously when we continue on further on in those lines in that very same paragraph, we kind of learn that actually he's more than just a villain, he's a victim in some ways as well, because we can see that asyndetic listing with words such as soaked, smothered, lamed, cut, stung, torn, to show the kind of struggles that the man's faced. Those kind of violent verbs shows that he's kind of powerless in comparison to nature. So maybe he is more vulnerable than we first anticipate. He's clearly suffering, so it's definitely something worth getting into response, because not only is this man potentially dangerous, but actually there's some sympathy potentially being created by the writer. So I think it's definitely important that we mention that as well. So what we're going to do then is put these ideas all together, and I'm going to show you a model response on the next slide that we're now going to mark as well. Okay, so first thing we're going to do is just have a read of this, and then we'll have a mark through with reference to the mark scheme. So it begins with, Dickens uses language to depict the man as a potentially vicious and dangerous character. The man is dressed all in coarse grain, implying that he is an escaped convict. The use of all shows that the man has been stripped of his true identity. There is nothing left of the man he once was, manipulated by the prison system into a life of savagery. Furthermore, the use of coarse reveals how solemn and poor quality the uniform is. Convicts were depicted as worthless, a burden on society, and therefore this symbolises the hardships faced in prison. Dickens highlights this further with the fact that the man wears a great iron on his leg, suggesting this has been forced upon him. The symbol of iron suggests that he is forever chained to his crimes. The noun iron has connotations of weight and restriction, highlighting to the reader that this man is potentially dangerous. However, despite this, Dickens expertly crafts the prisoner into a victim rather than a villain, where he uses a syndetic listing of soaked, smothered, lamed, cut, stung, torn to show the distress of the man. The repetition of violent dynamic verbs here highlights how powerless, despite artificially appearing intimidating, the man truly is. The man is suffering immensely. It is almost like nature also has turned its back on the man. Now here it probably doesn't look like a lot of writing for this 8-mark question. I know typically it gets suggested to write about 3 paragraphs. A little bit of a hack, and I don't want to tell you this to make you think you should only write 1 paragraph, but examiners tend to mark these, and as soon as you hit 1 skill in level 4, that means you're in level 4. You can't go back down. So if you hit level 4 in your first paragraph, then there is no way that you can end up with level 3 as you continue on with your paragraphs. So if you can write a really, really amazing first paragraph that hits level 4, great. The reason why teachers tend to suggest to write more is that you are more likely to achieve the more that you write, because obviously if your first paragraph isn't very good, maybe your second one is. And actually, even though this is only 1 paragraph, I can show you what I mean by that, because throughout this answer actually gets better. It starts off level 1 and it gets to level 4. That can happen in 1 paragraph, or it can happen in 3. So I would always recommend trying to write as much as you can, but that does not mean that you can avoid, or you can't, or you won't get 8 marks just because you've only written 1. So just a little bit of insight there to help you out. Start off just by looking at the first couple of sentences. It begins with a topic sentence that answers the question about the man. It is simple, just kind of vicious and dangerous, and uses kind of evidence to explain that. So it starts off at level 1, that quote all in coarse grey to support their point. You can start to see level 2 comments coming in. Now level 2 comments, sort of the 3 to 4 marks out of 8, are where there is some understanding. People are starting to make sense of the language used when they are hitting level 2. So there's a bit more understanding and comment on the effect of language there. Now you can see that when it says the use of all shows that the man has been stripped of his true identity. Now, this is a comment that we planned. Obviously, here it's just not quite so clear yet. Why does that word kind of show that, essentially? The bit where it starts to become more clear, that very same sentence actually, where it says there is nothing left of the man he once was, manipulated by the prison system into a life of savagery. So that's a lot more clear in the sense that now I understand what the use of the word all connotes and suggests in terms of this interpretation. So that's where it's more clear, because now I'm thinking, oh, he's all in coarse grey, that's all he is defined by the prison system, and so on. So it's a lot more clear. Really interesting comment to make as well. As we move on, you've got furthermore the use of coarse reveals how solemn and poor quality the uniform is. Convicts were depicted as worthless and a burden on society. So this is where there's a bit more context about the answer now. Like, we're using what we know about prisoners in society. They're a burden, and so therefore the uniform symbolises the hardships faced in prison because it's coarse, it's poor quality uniform. So that's more of a kind of detailed and interesting and perceptive comment now. There's more thought into the response. And now, because we've hit level 4 there, we're in level 4, so that's 7 or 8 marks, okay? So that's where now we know we've done what we needed to do. It goes on to kind of build on that just in case, and this is again what I'd recommend you guys do. Just build on what you know and show off what you know to really solidify those marks. It highlights this further with the fact that the man wears a great iron on his leg, those shackles that we spoke about. The symbol of iron suggests that he's forever chained to his crime. So it's again a really, really lovely comment to make, really kind of well considered and thoughtful response as well. The noun iron has connotations of weight and restriction as well, highlighting to the reader that this man is potentially dangerous, so solidifying that comment so it's really, really clear and makes perfect sense to the examiner as well. So that's where I've kind of got that idea from, and I've just made it clear in that next sentence. And then it goes on to say, despite this, Dickens expertly casts the prisoner into a victim rather than a villain, and we're just bringing in that comment about asyndetic listing that we planned that shows the distress of the man, and that's kind of reinforced with those dynamic verbs. And this is a really, really lovely comment, certainly level 4 analysis, because it explains the effect of language in detail and the kind of symbolism of him sort of being weak in comparison to the power of nature. It is almost like nature has turned his back on the man, he is suffering, and actually he's not as intimidating as we first thought. So you can see there that essentially there is a use of terminology. I have underlined those two, asyndetic listing and dynamic verbs, but it's kind of sprinkled throughout with words like symbolises and connotations as well. That is still subject terminology in English, so please don't feel like it always has to be the use of the verb or the use of the noun, because sometimes it can become a little bit meaningless. That is still terminology as well, so please don't worry about that. We've got our evidence, our quotations, and we've got our focus on the effect of language sprinkled throughout as well. That is the most important thing, the impact or the images that that language provides to the reader. That is what you have to get across in this answer, and this does one to a level 4 standard as it continues through. So let's just double check on the mark scheme on the next slide to decide whether we're giving it 7 or 8 out of 8. So here we've got all of the levels. Obviously we started off in level 1 and reached level 4 as we continued through that paragraph. So does it analyse the effect of the author's language selection? Absolutely. I showed you exactly where that happened. Chooses a well-considered variety of textual detail so that evidence is really concise. It's not just copying out large parts of the text. It's really kind of carefully chosen to build on the points that it raises in that paragraph. And then utilises advanced and precise subject-related terminology. Absolutely, yeah, it's not just kind of sprinkling in, oh, this is a verb, this is an adjective, this is a noun, just for the sake of it. It focuses on exactly what it needs to focus on and shows how those methods create an effect as well. So we can tick those all off for 8 out of 8 marks on this question. Okay, moving on to the structure question, you were asked to think about the whole of the source for this one, and as a reminder, how was the writer structure the text to interest you as a reader for 8 marks, spending approximately 10 minutes on this question, again, same as the previous one. So to achieve level 4 in this response, we have 3 bullet points to look out for again. Analysing the effect of the author's structural decisions. You'll notice in the last one it was language, this time it's structure, so it's how the text is built. And you're just thinking there about the purpose of doing so as well. So analysing the effect of those choices and the reason for those choices. So that's you essentially thinking about why there are any changes in character, any changes in setting, maybe it lingers on a character or setting as well. So it's not just about quick changes, it could be slow changes or no change at all. Any dialogue introduced and the purpose of that. Anything that changes in the narrative. There's lots and lots of structural things that you could look at, with juxtaposition as well being another one. To bullet point 2, you've got chooses a well-balanced selection of examples. Again, that's just the idea of references and evidence to support your argument. And then the third bullet point is employing advanced and precise subject-specific terminology. So those are the things that I just mentioned, actually naming the things that you spot, such as dialogue or narrative shifts, etc. Let's move on to the next slide, where we're going to plan our response with these 3 bullet points in mind. Okay, so as we're looking at this question, we're thinking about the whole of the text. When we're looking through it, you should be really kind of considering these 3 questions as you do. What, when, and why. So what method is being used, what's actually happening, what changes, for example. This is going to help you kind of identify those features to hit that mark scheme. The when is just simply beginning, middle or end. Now this doesn't have to be exact. I don't mean the very first line, the exact middle line, the absolute final line. It doesn't have to be that specific, because that will limit you in finding some really great things, but it's just an idea of kind of roughly where it happens. So later on as we move through the text, or further on in the text, or at the beginning or towards the end, that kind of language you could be using. And then the why obviously is the most important because that's the effect of that structure and the purpose of that structure and the kind of ideas that it might bring about in readers because of that structural feature. So really important you consider those as you're kind of reading and looking back through the source to help you to find out what you could use for this question essentially. Now, as we're planning, we want to kind of roughly look at the beginning, middle and end, and I would recommend that you do that as well. Your extract will typically be a little bit longer than the one we're looking at today, but just as a rough guide, that's how we're going to do it. So in the beginning of the extract, there is quite a detailed description of the man's appearance. We know that because of the previous questions we've looked at, with the description of the man and the language analysis for that, but this time structure. So we're not necessarily looking at the words, we're looking at the kind of reveal used by Dickens to kind of inform us about this character that we've just come across. So I want to be talking roughly about the kind of slow reveal of his hardships, the enumeration of his hardships. That just means one by one we learn some key things about him. For example, the fact that he's kind of like soaked in water and smothered in mud and so on and so on. It's like a one by one sort of effect. And the way that Dickens kind of zoom in allows us to really kind of picture that scene and feel this initial threat from the man. Now that's the kind of picture that we're provided in the beginning, isn't it? There's an early kind of focus on the threat and we're worried about what he's capable of at first. Obviously that does change, but we don't talk about that yet. We do also get the sense of kind of his struggles as well early on in the description, as spoken about in the previous language question, but just in terms of it becoming more clear, that does happen further along in the text as well, doesn't it? So we've also got, as the text continues, this shift in focus to dialogue, which essentially kind of heightens the tension because they're quite short and sharp sentences. There's lots of exclamation marks in the conversation, kind of showing this urgency, this immediacy between the two characters, and because it becomes a bit antagonising and a bit like an interrogation, it really builds up the kind of tension for readers as well. So we're really kind of concerned for Pip at this point as well, and he seems so vulnerable and the man is so aggressive, so it's a really kind of emotionally charged sort of atmosphere that's being built through the use of structure and such minimal dialogue as well. And because Pip is so vulnerable in that dialogue and that exchange as well, we've got this really clear use of juxtaposition between the fear and obviously the aggression from this man as well. So it's really immersive for readers, it's really tense for readers, we're really quite concerned as to what will happen to Pip. Will he be okay? So it's certainly worth writing down the idea of juxtaposition in our response as well. Now by the end it's made explicitly clear the kind of underlying reasons for this man's kind of aggression and the cause of his actions ultimately. So we kind of told that the reason for it is that he is absolutely starving. His hunger and his destitution kind of alters the lens for the readers as to why he is the way he is. So what was, I suppose, a threat ultimately becomes a facade for his deprived needs ultimately. So by the end we actually potentially might feel sympathy, and we're thinking again about how the text is interesting for a reader. That surprise that's deliberately crafted by Dickens towards the end creates this kind of deeper, sort of more complicated narrative through this character. On the next slide I'm going to show you a response based on the plan that we've got here. Now, because we are covering a bit more of the text, it's a little bit longer than the previous response. You still want to spend about 10 minutes on this question. So let's have a little read through and see how that plan has kind of come into action here. So it starts off with, firstly, Dickens focuses on a detailed description of the man's appearance, zooming in on the character's physical attributes, revealing his distressing state step by step. The enumeration of his hardships, soaked in water, smothered in mud, lamed by stones, cut by flints, stung by nettles and torn by briars, further magnifies the dire condition of the man. This zooming effect allows the reader to immerse themselves in the scene and feel the palpable threat emanating from the man. However, Dickens skillfully shifts the focus to dialogue as the narrative unfolds, effectively heightening the tension and intensifying the reader's engagement with the text. By employing short, sharp sentences and punctuating the dialogue with exclamation marks, the author injects urgency and immediacy into the conversation between Pip and the man. The interrogation-like exchange between the two characters contributes to the prevailing sense of danger, where Pip's vulnerability and the man's aggressiveness create an emotionally charged atmosphere. Moreover, the dialogue serves as a powerful narrative tool, propelling the plot forward while delving into the psychology of the characters. Pip's plea for his life, "Oh, don't cut my throat, sir, pray don't do it, sir," not only emphasises his desperate situation, but also offers insight into his fear and helplessness. Conversely, the man's demand for Pip's name and location further unveils his mysterious intent and establishes a palpable air of unpredictability. By cleverly blending descriptive prose with dialogue, Dickens effectively crafts a multidimensional and immersive reading experience. The juxtaposition of descriptive passages and sharp dialogue creates a dynamic rhythm that propels the narrative and heightens suspense. However, as the dialogue unfolds, the shift technique seamlessly transitions the reader's perception, redirecting attention from the man's physicality to the underlying cause of his actions. The sudden realisation that the man is driven by an insatiable hunger and destitution alters the lens through which the reader views him. The prolonged focus of the act of the man consuming the bread ravenously allows the reader to empathise with the man's plight. Initially portrayed as a menacing figure, the man's desperate hunger unravels the facade of threat, exposing a vulnerable and deprived individual instead. This transformative revelation evokes a sense of empathy and compassion in the reader, inviting deeper contemplation on the complexities of human nature. So kind of getting straight into marking it, I want to look at that very first paragraph. Now this focuses on the beginning, the idea of the physical attributes of the character that's been introduced to us. There is evidence used there and a simple kind of topic sentence kind of picking out a simple structural technique. So at very first we would put that into level 1, just simply because it says it focuses on the man's appearance and then there's evidence to prove it. It's quite simple at that point. The bit where it develops into something a bit more clear is where it states that it magnifies the dire condition of the man, which allows the reader to immerse themselves in the scene and feel a palpable threat emanating from this man. So it's not just saying the man's appearance kind of implies that he is sort of dirty or anything like that. There's a real palpable threat, this response says, coming from the man, and it's an immersive description as well. It's a really nice comment to make. It's nice and clear. Now you'll notice that that first paragraph doesn't just kind of fall into the trap of analysing the language, because we've already done that in the language analysis question. It focuses on the fact that the man is being described and there's a real kind of lengthy focus on him with this slow reveal of his hardship. So it's nothing to do with the choice of kind of verbs. We've already spoken about that in a different question. It doesn't fall into the trap of doing that. It talks about how it's a slow reveal, that enumeration of his hardships, and I want to make that very clear because we don't want to fall into the trap of analysing the words there. It might be that there are similar effects in that we can really understand the threat of this man or the kind of state that he's currently in, but what we've not done is talked about language, and I want to make that really, really clear. That's why this is a level 3 for this question, this structure question, rather than the language question. It would not gain the same marks if we were talking about verbs here, because it's fallen into the trap of analysing language that way. Now as we move on to this next paragraph, it focuses on dialogue. So there's a skillful shift in focus to dialogue, which effectively heightens the tension and intensifies the reader's engagement with the text. It doesn't just pick out that feature, it goes further with that feature in this paragraph, because it talks about how those sentences are short and sharp and punctuated with exclamation marks to kind of show and reveal this urgency and immediacy in the conversation. So obviously this character, this man whose name we do not know, is clearly feeling a sense of urgency there, perhaps because he's escaped from prison, and this paragraph kind of captures that urgency through the technique that's been identified. And it's almost like an interrogation it picks out, because there's lots of kind of really kind of short, sharp demands from this man, which then further highlights Pip's vulnerability as well, we've said. So in terms of that paragraph, again, we can label that as clear because there is a clear identification of structural technique, and in the response there is a clear comment on why Dickens has used those short, sharp sentences, because it kind of injects this urgency into the conversation. So very, very clear there. Now looking at that third paragraph, what's really nice about this is that it offers a kind of alternative interpretation of the purpose of this dialogue being injected into this narrative. So we've got more detail in the psychology of the characters, essentially, is what this paragraph is stating, through the kind of desperate plea from Pip for his life. It shows how desperate he is and how fearful he is and how helpless he is, while on the contrary, the man's demand for Pip's name highlights this urgency again and how unpredictable he is. And it's really captured in this response the difference between those two characters because of that dialogue. Now I spoke to you about considering what, when and why, and you can see the what being the dialogue, the when sort of further on in the narrative as it unfolds, and the why and this is what hits level 4 for me, is that bit at the bottom where it says how Dickens has cleverly blended descriptive prose with dialogue to create this multi-dimensional and immersive reading experience, which creates this kind of dynamic rhythm that propels the narrative and heightens the suspense. So rather than just kind of keeping it descriptive, the dialogue adds this kind of pace to it, speeds it up, it creates this urgency and this worry for readers as to how unpredictable this man is, as it says, and whether Pip is actually going to be okay. So now we know this response has hit 7 or 8 again because it's hit level 4 once, but we'll just have a look at this final paragraph too. So what's brilliant about this final paragraph is that we've got this kind of final focus on dialogue and how that kind of transitions into this focus on the need for this man to eat. That's when readers kind of suddenly realise that the man is not just a threat without reason, he is a threat because of his insatiable hunger. And the prolonged focus on the act of him eating that bread ravenously essentially really encourages empathy from the readers, and this is captured in this final paragraph here. It's really, really clear. It kind of shows that ladder approach from level 1 to level 4. Now the comment that really solidifies level 4 again is that last bit where it says this transformative revelation evokes a sense of empathy and compassion in the reader, inviting this bit deeper contemplation on the complexities of human nature. What's really lovely about that is that it considers the fact that the deliberate reveal at the end by Dickens is perhaps purposeful in the sense that he wants us to consider that this man is more than just a prisoner. There's more to people than just whether they're a prisoner or not. It's a really, really interesting comment on structure and a really, really deep and interesting argument that should hopefully be considered in the readers when they learn this kind of later on in this part of the text. Ultimately, the why is really, really captured in that final sentence. Why has Dickens done this? To potentially allow us to consider our own kind of judgments on people like this man here. Okay, so let's just have a quick look at the mark scheme and really kind of take note of how it hits the bullet points on this next slide. Okay, so you've got the top 3 bullet points we are looking at because we know we've already hit level 4. Does this response analyse the effect of the author's structural decisions? Yes, it does, particularly in those final 2 paragraphs is when it hits level 4. That comment at the end about the complexities of human nature is especially the bit for me that puts it into level 4 because that's a really detailed, analytical and perceptive comment on why Dickens has structured the text the way that he has. So certainly can give that one a tick. Secondly, you've got chooses a well-balanced selection of examples. That's a range of evidence. Definitely we look at the beginning, middle and end and how it kind of changes throughout, how the reader's perceptions change throughout because of any of those changes that are introduced and any of those shifts that are introduced. So definitely yes. And then finally, employs advanced and precise subject-specific terminology. Absolutely, we've got focus on dialogue and how it shifts and how Dickens deliberately transitions from dialogue to description and vice versa. We've got the focus on juxtaposition. We've got the consideration of punctuation as well. So there's lots and lots that are described in this response and selected for this response as well. So we can tick that one again for a total mark of 8 out of 8. Okay, so what we're going to do is have a look at the mark scheme for this 20 mark question, the one where you respond to a statement, and you'll see there are 4 bullet points there for you to achieve in this question. Don't forget, right at the start of this video I said that AO4 is all about evaluation. That's kind of weighing up the evidence that you have. And of course forming your own conclusion. So the first bullet point we've got is crafts a persuasive and critical reaction to the statement's call. Essentially all that means is you are responding to the statement and you'll see it kind of increases in complexity. The first bullet point in each level is the same, it just becomes more complicated and more challenging as you go further up those levels. So to be in the top level for that bullet point, you want to be really, really kind of convincing and critical. So you're using the evidence you've got, really concise evidence, to ultimately allow yourself to form an opinion and to explore the method used that gave you that opinion as well, as to whether you agree or disagree or partially. Now, if we look at bullet point 2, you've got demonstrates insightful comprehension of the author's methods. So that just builds on what I was saying. Perhaps there is a particular verb that kind of proves the statement you're looking at, or a simile, or some kind of structural feature that's used. We've obviously looked at some of those already, and that's why I would always say kind of do these questions in order, because you'll have a better picture, certainly after question 3, looking at the whole text, about what you could use here in this question. Third, you've got chooses a well-considered assortment of textual specifics. In other words, you've used quotations, and you've not just kind of used really, really large amounts of text to prove your point. You've used really concise bits of the text to prove exactly what you need to prove. So keep it nice and concise, don't copy out loads and loads, embed your quotations if you can as well. And then finally, you've got evaluates in depth and critically the impact on the reader. So this is where that evaluation comes in again. Do we actually feel quite concerned for Pip? Do we realise he's in quite a vulnerable situation? Now, so long as you are focusing on the statement about sympathising with Pip and seeing that he's in this kind of vulnerable, intimidating situation, you will hit that bullet point through the methods that you consider and through actually using the words from the statement in your question, because the words in the statement are all about the effect on the reader anyway. It makes us sympathise with Pip because he's in this situation. So long as you are actually responding to that question, you will hit that one because you've hit the others. So hopefully by looking at those 4 bullet points, you'll see that it's not actually too terrifying, even though it's a bigger question. The way that I would recommend looking at it is essentially it's very similar to the language question and the structure question, in that you are essentially just proving points, which is what you do anyway. You write yourself a topic sentence and then you go on to prove it. The one that we did for the language question was about the description of the man and our impressions of the man. And we prove it with evidence and we prove it with methods. Same in the structure question, and that is all that we are doing here. But the difference is they give us the question of whether we sympathise with Pip or not, and we just have to decide whether we agree or disagree. So actually, it gives you the parameters, whereas the language question doesn't. So I would see it as a little bit kinder in that sense, except it's just a bit longer, this one. So you want to be aiming for about 4 paragraphs, 20 minutes, and then moving on to your writing question if you didn't do that one first. So now we're going to spend a little bit of time planning. Looking at line 7 to the end of the extract, it says, one student said the writer makes us sympathise with Pip as he is clearly in an intimidating situation. To what extent do you agree with the student? Write about your own impressions, evaluate how the writer has created these, and then support your opinions with references to the text. So I'm just going to pop down there 20 minutes just so we're really clear on the time parameters for this question. And then we'll make a brief kind of plan ready to look at a model response. Now we know from the previous question that the man initially appears quite threatening and dangerous, when in fact we come to learn that his initial actions are because of a desperate need. So I definitely think that's worth getting in there. We certainly begin to learn that as we move through the text, and certainly from line 7 onwards. So there's a bit of an argument to be made here. I guess you have to decide whether you agree or disagree. And it's, in this question, actually probably quite easy to do a little bit of both, because we worry for Pip in that kind of exchange in the dialogue, and certainly how he's being kind of grabbed by his chin. And then as we move a bit further, our sympathy potentially shifts a little bit more towards this man. Obviously, we're still worried for Pip, but our focus, because of the way that Dickens structures it, is then kind of on the man. So in my plan, certainly I'm going to start off with the idea that we really do feel intense sympathy for Pip at first because of the threatening situation that he is in. It's through the dialogue as well, so that's a method that I'm going to explore to prove why initially I agree. He pleads, saying, "Don't cut my throat, sir, it's desperate." He's in a really perilous and potentially fatal situation, he feels. And because the emphasis is on that dialogue, because of the way that Dickens has structured it, we are immediately kind of thrust into this situation where we are more likely to agree, yes, he is in an intimidating situation. Just to add to that as well, you've got the use of that word cut, being this really kind of visceral image for readers, obviously adding to our worry. There's almost this kind of immersive connection through that really kind of aggressive and powerful verb. because that's his first thought, that's his first concern that will happen to him, just because this man has come seemingly to attack or to steal from him. That's his initial thought. So because of the immediate peril he feels, we sort of connect and sympathise. Now, as we kind of move through the extract, there's more kind of sensory detail that kind of adds to that sympathy that we feel as well. We really witness Pip's emotional turmoil here. Now we can see that through the fact he's quivering, the fact that he's trembling. We see almost the gravity of his dangerous situation, of his peril, because of that trembling as well. We therefore feel empathy, so we can really hone in on that idea of not just what he's saying, but actually what he's doing as well, in terms of how that increases sympathy for readers, going back to that statement every time in terms of evaluation. Now again, not just dialogue, we've got the act of the man quite literally turning Pip upside down to empty his pockets. Now that's a real clear violation of personal space, and if I'm thinking about imagery for the readers, imagining that in my head, I almost kind of see Pip as a toy, as an object, that the man quite clearly has the strength to do. He overpowers Pip here. So Pip, in comparison, his physical form is quite literally nothing. He doesn't seem to stand a chance in terms of strength in comparison to this man. So again, intensifying sympathy, because he's quite literally at the mercy of this man. He doesn't stand a chance, it seems. Now, as we've said throughout, our opinion of this man kind of changes quite significantly by the end, because we realise this man's plight, this man's struggle, and we really need to go into that, because there's this clear shift, this structural shift in terms of how we feel towards Pip. It's not that this man was ever potentially intending to deliberately hurt Pip. His actions come from a place of desperation and starvation, almost instinctual actions based on survival. And this really alleviates our initial sense of danger. Pip's literally just left watching him eat by the end, so where we were first really concerned for him, the shift, the really clever structural shift from Dickens, means that we feel almost sympathetic for the man by the end, because we realise that he's not this malevolent, cruel figure. It's just about survival, it seems. So we can be talking about structure here as well. The methods in the mark scheme aren't sort of suggesting that you should gear yourself towards just language analysis. We can talk about structure as well. And it's deliberately told to us at the end that this was all about survival, essentially. So we can definitely get that in there. Now, as we move on to looking at the response, I want you to be looking out for the ways that the response always goes back to that statement. It's really important that you do that. As I said before, your points are already kind of available for you. You just have to obviously agree or disagree, or partially agree and disagree in those points, but you have to always go back to that. So you don't have to come up with your own points like you do in question 2 or question 3. And that's why this question is quite nice. Obviously, it's just a little bit longer in terms of the marks available to you. So we're going to have a quick read through, looking at how that plan comes into effect as we go. So it starts off with, despite the man initially appearing vicious and savage, it is evident that Pip was never truly an intimidating situation. However, the man's appearance and initial actions do evoke sympathy for Pip, as he may have been in potential danger. Initially, it is difficult not to feel intense sympathy for Pip, as Dickens immediately draws the reader into an intense and threatening atmosphere through the effective use of dialogue. Pip's fervent plea, "Oh, don't cut my throat, sir," elicits an acute sense of apprehension and peril, and I can't help but feel the fear and danger that Pip is experiencing. The writer's adeptness in employing direct speech fosters an immediate and immersive connection, engendering within me a profound empathy for Pip's distressing plight, and igniting an ardent concern for his safety. The visceral and immediate reference to Pip's throat being cut imparts an instinctive and immediate sense of peril, heightening my anxiety and magnifying the menacing aura that envelops the scene. As the narrative unfolds, the inclusion of sensory details and subtle symbolism ensnares my senses, rendering Pip's emotional turmoil palpable and poignant. His quivering form and the tremor in his voice concretise his vulnerability, invoking a powerful emotional resonance within me. This masterful portrayal artfully kindles my compassion for Pip, as I can almost feel the tumult of emotions that surge through him in the face of such a daunting figure. The writer's astute utilisation of repetition, specifically regarding Pip's trembling, intensifies the gravity of his trepidation, infusing the scene with a sense of inexorable tension. With each recurrence, my empathy for Pip deepens, and I find myself longing for his escape from this situation. The act of the man turning Pip upside down and emptying his pockets feels like a violation of his personal space, and I can't help but see Pip as a toy, something for the man to play with. This intensifies my sympathy for Pip, as he appears to be at the mercy of this intimidating figure. However, as I continue reading, my initial sympathy for Pip undergoes a shift. When the man's true intentions are revealed, I begin to question my initial assumptions. I realise that perhaps the man is not as malevolent as I initially perceived. The man's ravenous hunger implies that his actions were likely driven by desperation and basic survival needs, rather than any ill intent towards Pip. This newfound context challenges the perception of the man as a malevolent character, leading the reader to reconsider their initial fear. Now, just initially looking at that opening, just a sort of brief introduction because it's a longer piece of writing. Not the end of the world if you don't do this, but it's a nice way to establish your kind of argument before you go any further. I would personally recommend it, if not just a sentence, and this one does that in a sentence. So it starts with the idea that the man is initially someone who comes across as vicious and savage, but then it becomes apparent that he was never actually in an intimidating situation after all. But because of what he does at first, we do feel that initial sense of sympathy for him. So it kind of establishes where the rest of the response is going. So we can start off with kind of level 1 there, because it's just kind of offer an opinion. It's how you use those methods and quotations and references, and overall evaluation by the end as to how you might achieve level 4. And looking at that kind of first paragraph of analysis and evaluation, initially, as we say, it's difficult not to feel intense sympathy. It uses the quote that we planned, "Don't cut my throat, sir," and explains the idea that it's an intense and threatening atmosphere at first. So there's this kind of attempt almost at introducing an argument. So a point and a quote, we can put that into sort of level 2, not at the top of level 2 because I've not actually done anything with explanation yet. We'll look at how that kind of develops as we go, but certainly level 2 there. And then it goes on to say that the writer's adeptness in using direct speech fosters this immediate connection for readers, and this profound empathy. The bit where it talks about direct speech is kind of beginning to focus on methods, so much better there in terms of analysis and evaluation and kind of proving your argument that you've established in that kind of topic sentence. And then where it talks about the visceral image or reference to Pip's throat being cut, creates this immediate sense of peril, which heightens the reader's anxiety. Now, don't forget, we have to kind of link back to the reader and consider method as well to allow us to evaluate overall. In terms of levels, it's very, very clear by the time we're talking about direct speech, fostering an immediate connection. That's considering the method very clearly. And the thing for me that puts it into level 4 is that final comment about the visceral reference to Pip's throat being cut imparts an instinctive sense of peril. And this is because it's evaluative, and it's a really, really deep, thoughtful comment to make, in the sense that we relate not just because we feel sorry for him, we relate because it's an instinctive concern. We would feel concern for survival if we were in that same situation as well. So it's this instinctive connection, that feeling of just point blank needing to survive. So now that we've hit level 4 there, we are in that level 4 bracket of 16 to 20 marks. Let's see how the rest of this response kind of builds to that, to see if we can sort of climb that ladder even more as well. Don't forget, once we've already hit that bracket, we then don't go down. The examiner is not looking to punish you for any further comments that you make. It's just about solidifying it from here and improving marks within that bracket. Now, if you look at this next paragraph, we've got this focus on the turmoil that Pip is experiencing emotionally. He's quivering and he's Pip's trembling as he's watching the man as well. So we've got more focus on the sensory imagery that was in our plan. For this one, I would actually put it into level 2 just because it's not quite clear in the sense that it talks about repetition. And when it talks about repetition, it talks about the repetition of Pip's trembling, when actually in the extract it just mentions that once. We could say there's this repetition in terms of his physical form, but just to make that clear, that's probably where it doesn't quite hit level 3. Certainly in the way it talks about reader comments, sort of effect on the reader, that is really, really brilliant. And the idea of intensifying the gravity of his trepidation, that is brilliant too. Certainly level 3, even level 4 comments there. It's just in terms of the level 2 method, it's not quite clear in terms of how it's conveyed. But don't forget, we're already in level 4 from that brilliant second paragraph, or that first kind of piece of analysis anyway. So we are all good there. Now, as we move towards those final 2 paragraphs, you've got the idea of Pip being turned upside down, just like we said we were going to focus on in our plan, and how it kind of gives this image to readers of Pip almost being like a toy or something for the man to play with, and it intensifies sympathy for Pip. Now here it's kind of level 2 again, in the sense that it just sort of establishes the argument. It doesn't really provide evidence or any deep analysis of methods. We could have really, really focused on the imagery of Pip being like a toy, but it's quite a quick comment there. We need to kind of zoom in a little bit more for those higher level responses. We might, for example, look at the language being sort of passive from Pip, in terms of him being the sort of narrator of this story. He is turned upside down. The quote says, "Turned me upside down and emptied my pockets." So he is completely passive in this situation, whereas the man is the active character. He's the one that's in charge, and we might look at that language and almost the direct nature of that language too. There's no almost emotion to it. Turned me upside down. It's quite a simple and declarative statement to make. It kind of suggests the fact that, again, the man is in charge. It takes no effort for him to do so. That's the kind of thing that might push it up in terms of that analysis of method. Then finally, you've got this focus on the shift in terms of sympathy. The man's true intentions are revealed, and therefore it says in the response, "I begin to question my initial assumptions. The man is not as malevolent as initially perceived. The actions were likely driven by desperation and basic survival." The bit that I really like here is this newfound context challenges the perception of the man as a malevolent character, leading the reader to consider their initial fear. Now, it's a really, really nice comment to make, in the sense that we don't necessarily worry for Pip here, we worry for this man, the plight that he's experienced, and we may, hopefully, feel some kind of empathy, and Dickens looks to elicit that from readers as well. Obviously, the way that he is left sitting, just watching this man eat by the end, kind of removes that sense of danger as well. So there, we can put it back into level 4. The analysis is more developed, it's more perceptive to make as well, especially that bit where it talks about this newfound context, because it brings in that idea of structure being an important aspect in how readers' perceptions change in terms of sympathy. So to just show you the mark scheme on the next slide, I'm going to show you how I might fine-tune to decide on a mark for this response. Now I'm going to start off by saying this response gets 18 out of 20, and I want to go through these bullet points to show you how that is achieved. The first one says crafts a persuasive and critical reaction to the statement score. We can tick that one because it's got the idea throughout that's well reasoned and well sort of argued. It doesn't matter whether you fully agree, fully disagree, or a little bit of both. I want to keep saying that. So long as it is well reasoned and sort of well supported throughout. There is a building argument throughout this as to why we've decided what we've decided. So we can tick that one. Now the next one says demonstrates insightful comprehension of the author's methods. Now, as I said when I was going through, I think there's a few opportunities missed in terms of zooming in. So for that one, I'm going to tick the level 3 second bullet point where it says demonstrates a distinct grasp of the author's methods. Certainly there is a focus on methods throughout this piece, definitely there is, but there are some missed opportunities as well, just to really kind of fine tune in that level 4 and climb that ladder. The next one says chooses a well-considered assortment of textual details. You'll see in the response that sometimes there's a few quotations missing. To be clear, we don't always have to use quotations, references do count as well. But in terms of just making it clear what specific moment you're referring to, and then being able to zoom in on language when you have the quotations there at your disposal, it's probably more safe to use them. So I'm going to put that one into level 3, chooses a variety of appropriate text details, certainly. And the final one, evaluates in depth and critically the impact on the reader. There are some really, really lovely comments on the effect on the reader in that response. Some really, really, really lovely comments. So that one, in terms of it being thoughtful and evaluative and critical, definitely. We can tick that one. So that's how it hits 18 out of 20. Okay, so we are at our final question, and the first thing I want to do is show you the mark scheme for both AO5 and AO6. Now, I've just put level 4 and level 3 here for AO5 just to show you that first and foremost. Obviously, I want you aiming for these higher ones, so I want to show you what you need to be super successful in this question. So the first one says, in upper level 4, communication is persuasive and engaging. So essentially, to be in that 20 to 24 bracket, your communication throughout your piece of writing has to be really, really gripping for your examiner and for your reader. It has to be essentially clear and interesting. Now, the first thing I will say on this is that you absolutely want to kind of stick to an event within your narrative that isn't too extreme. It's so important not to kind of bring in something drastic that happens, because I don't think the best authors in the world could put together a really, really gripping piece of writing about a massive tragedy such as, I don't know, a car accident or a murder scene or some kind of abduction. So try to avoid anything too drastic. I'm talking as small as a child loses their teddy bear, for example, because you can really hone in on emotions, facial expressions. It gives you more to zoom in on because you can really focus on tiny features rather than trying to cram in such a massive event in just around 5 paragraphs or so. So please avoid those. They never tend to do well. That bullet point says persuasive, and it will hardly be persuasive if it's this really unconvincing narrative, so do avoid. It's hard to be engaging as well because you can't really zoom in on those things. Now, looking at bullet point 2, you've got the tone, style and register adeptly align with the intended purpose and target audience. So that's a very, very fancy way of saying that your writing suits your audience. The style really, really kind of gears towards the style of writing you're being asked to write. So if you're being asked to write a story, it looks like a story. And if you're being asked to write a speech, for example, in the other paper, then it looks like a speech. So essentially, you've got to be considering the style that comes with highlighting the keywords in the question and being really certain of your choice as well, because you do get 2 options. Moving on to that third one, rich and bold vocabulary coupled with consistent usage of language techniques. Again, really fancy way of saying use varied and rich vocabulary and vary your language techniques as well. So you want to keep them really purposeful, and I think that word should be in your head as you're sort of planning and writing as well, not just kind of sounding like you've swallowed a thesaurus. Sometimes it's kind of hard to take those seriously when every single word is the biggest possible synonym that you could think of. And by purposeful, I just mean considering the choices of words really carefully for the intended effect. So, for example, the word killed is very, very different to the word slaughtered, or passed away, for example, is very, very different because it kind of connotes a lot more peace to the situation. So you're just really carefully thinking about your words and your synonyms and those intended effects, along with obviously the purpose and the effect of your language techniques that you're going to be using as well. Sometimes similes can come off a little inappropriately as well. So just really using them if you're confident using them as well. Don't just throw them in there because you think that you should. The next 3 bullet points are all under the subheading organisation. So that's just essentially how you're putting your piece together. So with the first bullet point, you've got creative and diverse application of structural elements. And essentially, you're just thinking about the structure overall here, varying your structural features, your style, your mood, your tone. It might be that there's some repetition or juxtaposition in there, for example. And again, they are considered with purpose and with effect in mind as well. The fifth one says the composition is captivating, featuring a spectrum of intricate and persuasive concepts. So again, very, very wordy, but all that means is organised in a way to intrigue the readers. So with that one, essentially, I want you to be thinking, show the readers, don't tell them. Show them through your language, show them through your structure. Don't just tell them straight away, because that can sound very frank and it kind of means that you don't end up describing like you should. And finally, you've got bullet point 6, smoothly connected paragraphs enriched by effortlessly blended discourse indicators. So you're using paragraphs and they all flow really, really well. You've got this idea of them being enriched by effortlessly blended discourse indicators. So it's really clear where your paragraphs start and end. It's clear where there might be a change in setting because of how you've used paragraphs, or a change in who's speaking when you use dialogue, because that should always go on to a new line as well, for example. You're considering making it really clear when there's a change in character, or an introduction of a character, or a change in time, for example. So all of those things have been really carefully considered to achieve in that bullet point. So to summarise, AO5 is all about the language and structure within your writing. So when we look at AO6, it's all about SPAG. We'll look at that next. Okay, so we have AO6, which is 16 marks of the possible 40 available for this final writing question. It is based on SPAG, so spelling, punctuation and grammar. Now, 16 marks is a huge amount. It could be the difference between a grade, so it's really, really important that you take this part of the mark scheme very seriously. It's why your teachers nag so much about SPAG. Now, the first bullet point says sentence boundaries are consistent, defined and consistently precise in that level 4 bracket. So this is all about making sure your sentences start and end where they should, and it's clearly marked with punctuation. So essentially, I know where the starts and ends of your sentences are. It's not one huge long sentence for a whole paragraph that doesn't actually make any sense. I can see where they start and end. That's consistently precise as well, so it has to be consistently accurate. The second bullet point says a broad spectrum of punctuation is applied with great precision. So varied and accurate punctuation throughout essentially is all that is asking you to do. It might be that you use commas, but you use commas with embedded clauses. That's varying, even just a comma. This even includes things like speech marks as well, with a little piece of dialogue that you might use. It includes colons, semicolons, exclamation marks, question marks, and it's just using them correctly as well, importantly. So don't feel like you have to throw in a semicolon just because you think that you should. The whole of your piece isn't going to come crumbling down if you don't use one of those, especially if you are not 100% confident with using them. Don't vary your punctuation because you think that you should vary your punctuation because you can. It doesn't just have to be all those ones that we consider fancy ones, like semicolons, for example. The third bullet point says employs a comprehensive array of sentence styles for effect. This just means really varying your sentence styles. So not starting with the and I constantly. You might start with an adverb, for example. You might use embedded clauses, and that's a nice way of kind of showing off varied punctuation as well, because you're using commas in a different way there, like we said. It's just really about kind of purposefully crafting your sentence structures, again, just to show that your writing is more than just simple. You've really learned how to convey your ideas in real carefully structured sentences. Number 4, this is no surprise, I'm sure you've heard it in your lessons, and when you've been sort of revising, this should be part of your practice as well. Consistently employing standard English with a firm grasp of intricate grammatical constructs. All that means is just communicating your ideas in correct English, avoiding slang essentially. So nothing that you won't have heard before in terms of putting your ideas together in an English lesson. Bullet point 5 says excellent spelling precision, including challenging vocabulary choices. So I want to make this clear, this is almost perfect spelling. You aren't going to lose all of those marks just because you misspell one word, but it's just about showing off your ability to use more challenging vocabulary, being able to spell those words as well. And then finally, you've got bullet point 6, expansive and bold vocabulary use, which just builds on that previous one. You're not just spelling simple words correctly, you're spelling more complex words correctly too. Now with this, what's really lovely is that you are essentially double marked on vocabulary. So it was in the AO5 mark scheme and it is in this AO6 mark scheme as well. So you really want to be varying your vocabulary and really sort of practicing synonyms for words in your revision, because you are double marked for it. It's the only one that is offering you double marks, so please practice that, but obviously in a purposeful sense as well, not just throwing in words just because you think that you should. Now on the next slide, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the question, choose one of the options and form a plan. Okay, so final question, let's have a look at our options. It says that you are advised to spend about 45 minutes on this section to write in full sentences and plan your answer, leaving enough time at the end to check. So always read those instructions, it's important that you do. And you are given 2 options. So it says you are going to enter a creative writing competition. Option 1, write a description suggested by this picture, you can see it there. And then option 2, or write a story about a time where you felt afraid. Now for this video, I'm going to choose option A. There are some videos that you will see where option B has been chosen as well, where there's the story option. I'm going to go option A. It doesn't matter which one you choose. Sometimes it's often sold to people as though choosing option B is going to somehow inhibit your marks because it's more childish to write a story. That's not true. It's all about how you craft. So we're going to plan based on the picture that we have available there. So when I'm planning, I'm going to use the drop, shift, zoom, link way to plan my answer. I don't really want you to use this as paragraph structure as such, more of a planning structure just to kind of get your ideas together, because you can mix those up or use, say, zoom more than once or shift more than once. Mine certainly will with the ideas that I'm going to sort of pop down now. Essentially, I want you to not be limited by structures or paragraph structures so much. So use them to help you. You will have some that were provided to you at school. Lots of different schools do it differently. So I don't necessarily want to tell you in this paragraph do this, in this paragraph do this. The reason why I'm giving this structure is just that it's quite general, it's quite generic. So it might be that the one that you have learnt kind of fits with this one too. It's just a different way of thinking about it, but still achieving the same things. All of the structures that you get are there to hit the mark scheme, no matter whether it looks like mine or whether it looks like one that you have learnt. In this case, when we're thinking about drop, shift, zoom and link, we're thinking about dropping our reader into a certain situation. So it might be that your structure that you have learnt drops the reader into a description of the sky, for example, or into a scenario that a character's in. You'll see how they kind of blend together. It's just a nice way to help you guys revise. With my drop, I'm going to drop the reader into an icy marshland. Now I'm looking at that picture and it says suggested by this picture in the question. So I don't have to use it exactly as it is there. There is no character in there. I'm going to add a character. There's no ice there, I'm going to add ice. It's just a description suggested by the picture, so don't freak out when you get something that looks quite simplistic or there's nothing going on there. It is up to you to bring in whatever you want to bring. The picture is simply inspiration, and that's really important. So in mine, icy marshland, and I really want to kind of bring in this idea of death and desolation here. I want to go with the fact it's quite haunting because it's so icy and barren. I want to go with the idea that everything's really dormant and still. And I really want to kind of emphasise that stillness as well, that it's almost tangible. I want to include the idea that we've got the earth, water and sky. And I might use a metaphor there, this idea of a symphony. of the earth, water and sky, and how it seems to be in this kind of deep slumber. I want to use this idea of sleep to really kind of convey the idea of winter. When we think of winter, everything's asleep, everything's kind of deathly, it can almost be quite haunting because of that stillness. So I really want to convey that in the first paragraph, that idea of dropping the reader into that really kind of chilling scenario. Now, when I've really worked to establish that chilling, icy scene, that really empty scene, I'm going to shift my focus and bring in a character. So that comes into that plan again, drop, shift, zoom, link. With the shift, I want to bring in a character that is quite fearful of this situation. It can be whoever you want them to be. Again, don't go too extreme in terms of what they're there to do. No murders, I would say. I'm going to go with a character called Emily, a young artist who is there to draw and capture that scene. She's usually really, really adventurous and really excited to do this, but for some reason, there's this real sense of foreboding, this unease that she feels that she can't really explain. And I want to do that because I want to kind of intrigue my readers. If I'm thinking about the idea of show not tell again, I'm showing the readers that there is something going on here. It grips the readers, it encourages them to really stick by the story because something's not quite right and we don't know what that is yet. So I want to capture that in that second paragraph. Now, as we move on, I'm going to zoom back in on that marshland, and I want to bring in that haunting idea again that I wanted to capture at the start. So I might consider things like the noises or lack of. So let's go deafening silence, the idea that the silence is actually more fearful than noises to Emily. She is going to come across kind of really bare trees, so I might call those trees skeletal. I might call them almost like eerie silhouettes because I want to bring in that ghostly feel for building on that sense of unease that she's experiencing as she's trying to seek the perfect place to draw her picture. Now, this next bit is where I'm going to stray away from using the structure so rigidly to form paragraphs, but instead I'm going to shift instead of link here. And I'm going to shift back to Emily's thoughts, and she's thinking about last summer. And I want to do that because I want to bring in this varied structure. It's effective to consider structural shifts in your writing and implement structural shifts in your writing. So she's going to be thinking back to last summer, and there's going to be this contrast between what it is now and what it was then. Because we've talked about silence in that paragraph, I might bring in the idea of the noise of songbirds singing, perhaps joyous melodies. I'm going to bring a life back into the scene in terms of her memories. So there will be animals, they won't be hibernating, of course. And I just want to do that so we've got that real clear contrast in terms of our structural variation to hit that mark scheme. And then I'm going to zoom in on that longing for summer. So I've contrasted, and then I'm going to zoom in on that longing from her perspective as well. So the fact that she might be really longing for the warmth of the sun. We've used that idea of symphony early on. Might contrast that with a symphony of colours, whereas we're really lacking in colour early on. So you can see how I'm consciously considering the start and the comparisons throughout, because it makes for really effective structural features. So do try and do that as well. Think about differences from things that you bring in early on. I might consider the fact that she's kind of hurrying a little bit because she's quite nervous still as well. So we've got this kind of idea of longing versus reality too. You can see with my plan as well, again, there's nothing too extreme happening. She's simply trying to find a place to draw, and she feels on edge, she feels uneasy. And by doing that, it increases tension. She's still walking quite nervously. And I want to capture that so that readers can be questioning, well, why does she feel so uneasy? Nothing extreme has happened. It builds up that tension because we're keen to see, well, what is it? What's happening? Why does she feel this way? This is where structural shifts can be really, really effective because readers will be asking those questions. Why does she feel this way? But in this next bit, I'm completely going to shift the mood, tone, and atmosphere so that when she finds her place, her perfect place to sit and draw, she actually realises the beauty of this frozen landscape. I'm going to craft it through this really poignant moment of the sun appearing. We might not see a lot of sunshine in the winter, certainly, but here there's going to be a sort of glow over the ice, this really kind of almost supernatural, beautiful glow that is almost the turning point for her. That's what I want to craft, that sudden turning point for her and for the readers, actually, so that she feels more at ease and then recognises the beauty in nature even when it is asleep. And here we can kind of bring that idea of sleep back, but in a more peaceful sense. Instead of it being still and eerie and terrifying, now there's a beauty in that stillness, because there's a beauty in rest and waiting and sort of patience. And it's almost this kind of epiphany that I want to sort of craft in this moment for this character as well. Nearly there. We're going to now just zoom in on the fact that she is drawing. Her heart might still be fluttering, just not necessarily from fear anymore, but more from awe. Or we could combine those emotions, because she's just kind of recovering from that unease and sense of foreboding that she was experiencing before. And I really want to zoom in on every stroke of that pencil on the paper. Really, really tiny features like that to sort of build up that connection with the character almost. As her eyes capture the lake, we're capturing the lake. As her eyes capture the sky, we see the sky. So really, really slow down the pace now, because it's been hopefully quite pacey through how I might structure my sentences. I might slow down my vocabulary here as well and use kind of longer words to create that, really slow down the reader so that they can almost kind of embrace this sense of calm that the character will feel in the piece of writing here at this point. And then finally, I'm going to use my link right at the end. Always save that one till the end. I'm going to create this cyclical structure. So where at the start we were really considering the idea of winter almost being dead, the world was asleep, I'm going to bring back that motif of sleep again. This time I'm going to make it sound more peaceful. Sleep sounded quite threatening at the start, so this time I'm going to try and make it sound a little bit more peaceful. The marshland will be wrapped in a winter cocoon, so it's more about hibernation. It's undisturbed and it's at peace because it's undisturbed. So in this way, the stillness sounds a lot less threatening, and we can see the beauty even in this winter kind of desolate scene. And that'll be sort of the lesson for her by the end of this piece. So now that we've got our plan together, we're going to put this into action, and you can see how that's come together on the next slide. And of course, as always, we will mark that as well. Okay, so this goes over 2 pages. I will read this first bit, mark this first bit, and then we'll move on to the next section of this response. So it starts off with, winter's icy grip had descended upon the marshland, transforming it into a hauntingly beautiful tableau. The landscape, once adorned in lush greens and vibrant blooms, now lay dormant and tranquil beneath a mantle of glistening frost. The stillness was almost tangible, interrupted only by the occasional call of a distant crow or the faint rustle of more bare branches swaying in the crisp breeze. The marsh, an enigmatic symphony of earth, water and sky, seemed to be in a deep slumber, preserving its energy for the awakening that would come with the first signs of spring. Amidst the wintry stillness of the marshland, a lone figure cautiously made their way through the frozen terrain. It was Emily, a young artist who sought inspiration in the ethereal beauty of nature, but today an inexplicable unease had settled within her, and her usually adventurous spirit was overshadowed by a sense of foreboding. The marshland, so serene yet enigmatic, seemed to hold secrets that whispered on the frigid winds. The deafening silence amplified every crunch of Emily's footsteps, making her feel like an intruder in a world that had withdrawn into deep slumber. The sight of gnarled branches and skeletal trees seemed to form eerie silhouettes, and every rustle of the frost-dusted grass sent shivers down her spine. Despite the fear gripping her heart, Emily couldn't deny the allure of marshland's mystique. Her sketchbook and charcoal pencils were ever ready, and she felt compelled to capture the haunting grandeur that surrounded her. She thought back to last summer and how the once flourishing wildlife of the marshland had retreated into hidden sanctuaries, where they sought refuge from the harsh elements. This time, the air was devoid of the joyous melodies of songbirds and the gentle hum of insects. Even the elusive marsh hare and fox were scarce, leaving behind a void that seemed to echo in the hushed landscape. She wrapped her coat tightly around herself, trying to ward off the chill that seemed to seep into her very bones. With hurried steps, Emily retraced her path, her mind filled with images of the vibrant marshland she had encountered during summertime. She yearned for the warmth of the sun, the gentle hum of life, and the symphony of colours that had once adorned this very place. Yet her anxious thoughts collided with the reality of the frozen landscape she now traversed. At last she found herself back at the heart of the marsh, near the creek where she had begun her journey. Now, what I want to do here quickly is just kind of mark off the drop, shifts and zooms that we've got on this page, just so you can see how that plan kind of comes into action. So in that first paragraph, we are dropped into the scene. Just going to mark those as I go. We are given a shift with the introduction of the character Emily in that second paragraph. Then it zooms in on the marshland in the third paragraph. You've got this shift to the thoughts of last summer, just at the bottom of the left-hand side into the right-hand side, and just kind of zooming in on her emotions again and her longing for summer. Now, if you're just looking at that first paragraph, the first thing that stands out to me is the real clever use of kind of sensory description. It's really vivid, and it's clearly inspired by the stimulus that's provided, that picture that's provided. The vocabulary is really ambitious and varied as well. We've got words like tableau, we've got words like enigmatic, adorned, dormant, tranquil, slumber, hauntingly. There's lots in there. So straight away it's making an impression in terms of vocabulary. Now in terms of imagery, you've got this idea of winter's icy grip, almost making it seem quite threatening, like an enemy, quite dangerous. That word hauntingly as well. Got this idea of dormant being that stillness that we wanted to craft, that we talked about with the plan, emphasised again with the word stillness, and it almost being quite tangible, so it's really, really felt everywhere. The deliberate choice of the bird as well, a crow, typically symbolic of sort of death as well, so there's that real kind of fearful, haunting atmosphere crafted in this first paragraph, through lots of sensory description and vivid description and lots of varied vocabulary as well. Now as we move into that second paragraph, we've got this shift in focus to the character Emily. As we said with our shift, they're established and there's an appropriate amount of detail kind of shared about her as well. She's a young artist, and for whatever reason she feels unsettled and her spirit is overshadowed by a sense of foreboding. Now, this is quite clever because it's quite minimalistic, but it creates questions for the reader, and we do go on to learn more about what she's doing as we sort of continue through the piece of writing as well. So there's this intrigue created. Now there's two things that are quite clever here. You've got the variation of sentences amidst the wintry stillness of the marshland, so nice kind of varied openings there. And then the idea that she is a lone figure as well, just to emphasise her vulnerability. And onto that third paragraph, you've got the zoom in on this marshland, serene yet enigmatic, so mysterious. And holding those secrets seems to create this kind of fearful mystery again, this vulnerability for Emily, so really cleverly crafted in terms of language devices there. You have the idea of slumber appearing, so there's this motif of sleep appearing again. Skeletal trees and eerie silhouettes building on that haunting feeling and fear that grips her heart. So there's this real building of tension and fear in terms of the slow kind of building and description of this marshland at the same time. You've got oxymoron in the phrase deafening silence as well, the idea that even the silence is problematic as she moves through this setting. And then by the time we get to the end of that paragraph, we realise that she's still really intrigued by the mystery of this setting and the allure of this setting. So we're then sort of realising that she's not giving up despite her fear, and we're kind of keen to see how this kind of pans out, whether she'll be okay, if her fears are just sort of personal or legitimate fears, something's going to happen potentially. So it's really, really cleverly crafted in terms of slow reveals, showing the reader and not telling them about the setting and the fear that she is experiencing. With this shift in the fourth paragraph, we're thinking back to last summer now, and there's this real clever structural contrast here between what it is in that first paragraph and what it is here. We've got thriving colours, we've got flourishing wildlife. There's this real sense of life within this paragraph. There's joyous melodies from songbirds, which is a contrast to that crow and that deafening silence we were talking about before. And the elusive marsh hare and fox are scarce, so there's nothing there, there's this void. So there's this real contrast between life and death here, and it's really cleverly structured to create this longing that she has. Now, don't forget, the mark scheme asks for creative and diverse application of structural elements, which has clearly been applied here in terms of that contrast between winter and summer and how she's feeling as well. She continues to move through this landscape, and there's this chill that seems to seep into her bones. She's hurrying, so there's this sense of trepidation and worry, almost this concern that we feel for her too. And she can't help but long for that summer. There's this real focus again on summer, the warmth of the sun, the hum of life, the symphony of colours. But still, her anxious thoughts collide with that reality. So there's this almost crash back into reality, back into the winter landscape that she's actually in. And in that same moment, she finds herself back at the heart of the marsh near the creek where she begins her journey. And this is the bit just before it kind of takes a turn. So just quickly looking, again, you've got that kind of structural contrast between winter and summer. Really lovely, vibrant vocabulary actually as well. The word vibrant, the word adorned, the word yearned, and just kind of that sensory imagery of her wrapping her coat tightly around herself because the chill seems to seep into her very bones. It's very vivid and very visceral there. It's really cleverly thought out in this response. Now, I have mentioned the mark scheme, but not in its entirety, because you tend to, as an examiner, read the full response for these writing questions first to form an overall judgment before you kind of fine tune and decide what mark you want to give the candidate. So typically, we read the whole thing first. Obviously, I've kind of given clues to where roughly it might be so far. I've mentioned that it was in level 4 in terms of the structural elements, really, really quite creative, and the vocabulary has been really, really rich and bold so far. So there's definitely elements of level 4, but because communication is one of the most important things, if your communication is off and it doesn't make sense, it can't possibly be in level 4. So we actually need to read the full response to make a really kind of full judgment, but there are definitely level 4 features so far. So let's carry on with it. Okay, so I'm just continuing with that sentence from the previous slide, and it starts off with, the setting sun cast an ethereal glow over the ice, as if the marshland was bidding her farewell, inviting her to return when the world had awakened from its slumber. And so Emily paused, feeling the final remnants of fear dissipate, replaced by a profound reverence for the marsh's quietude. She realised that this marshland, in its dormant state, had its own kind of beauty, a beauty of stillness, of rest and of waiting. It was a necessary phase in the cycle of life, a time for introspection and renewal. She needed this. The marsh knew this. With her heart still fluttering from the mix of fear and awe, Emily found a sheltered spot amidst a cluster of tall reeds near the creek. The ground was covered with a delicate layer of frost, and she hesitated for a moment before settling herself down, careful not to disturb the fragile tranquillity of the marshland. As she opened her sketchbook, a profound stillness seemed to envelop her. The only sounds were the faint crackling of ice and her own steady breaths. Emily took a moment to absorb her surroundings, letting her senses soak in the scene before attempting to translate it onto paper. Her fingers trembled slightly as she dipped her charcoal pencil onto the blank page. But as her first strokes touched the paper, she felt a calming connection with the marshland. The sketch took shape gradually, capturing the essence of the frozen landscape, the subtle interplay of light and shadows. Breathe, Emily, breathe. Emily began with the creek, its icy edges contrasting against the dark water that still flowed beneath, hinting at life beneath the frozen surface. She carefully detailed the slender reeds lining the water's edge, etching the intricate patterns formed by the ice crystals clinging to their surfaces. Each line was a tribute to the resilience of nature, showcasing its ability to find beauty even in the most austere of seasons. As her gaze shifted upward, she focused on the bare trees that stood like stoic sentinels along the marsh's fringes. She depicted their gnarled branches with painstaking precision, capturing the complexity of their forms and how they seemed to reach out like skeletal fingers as if longing for the caress of spring. Emily's sketchbook became a testament to the marshland's winter beauty. Her art was a dialogue with nature, a communion with the hidden emotions she had experienced during her time here. Each stroke was infused with the emotions that had washed over her: fear, admiration, vulnerability, and ultimately acceptance. With a sense of peace settling within her, Emily closed her sketchbook, a smile gracing her lips. She felt grateful for the fear that had brought her here, for it had led her to witness the marshland's winter slumber, a vision that few had the chance to behold. As she stood up to leave, she knew that she would return, not just in the spring, but in each season, to bear witness to the marshland's ever-changing beauty and find inspiration in its timeless whispers. And so the marshland remained, wrapped in its winter cocoon, biding its time until the first signs of spring emerged. Patient and undisturbed, it slumbered on. Now again, I just want to mark off the shifts and the zooms where they're relevant. So in this paragraph that was sort of begun on the previous slide, this is definitely another shift in the sense that this is probably the biggest shift you'll find. We'll talk about it more properly shortly, but it's the part where she loses her fear and she feels almost sort of in awe of nature. So we've got that real significant shift. And then we zoom in that sort of more chunky paragraph with her heart still fluttering. We zoom in on her drawing, her admiration of nature, the peace that she kind of begins to feel because of the tranquility that she notices around her. And then kind of continuing with that, she starts with the drawing. This is really kind of slow description of her drawing to really slow the pace down and bring in that tranquility for readers. And then we've got this link right at the very end where it says the marshland remained wrapped in its winter cocoon. So there's this link, this cyclical structure in terms of at the beginning it was asleep in a kind of much more terrifying and eerie sense, and now there's this element of peace with sleep as well, almost like this epiphany that's been had for Emily. Now in that sort of first paragraph on this screen, you've got this sudden epiphany for Emily, shown through, again, really, really lovely varied vocabulary and these really kind of detailed sentences as well. There's this pause and the kind of punctuation there, and so, comma, Emily paused, comma. There's this really like slow, sudden realisation that there was no reason to be scared, and she gains this reverence, in other words, this respect for the marsh, and her fear kind of dissipates. So there's this sudden awakening for her almost, and she sees the beauty in that stillness. And it's really, really thoughtful in this response because it considers this cycle of life as well. Really, really detailed, lovely ideas. It goes on with these varied paragraphs then. So you've got these smoothly connected paragraphs. She needed this, the marsh knew this, and then with her heart still fluttering, they flow on really, really well. It all builds on the previous paragraph. It makes sense and flows seamlessly. And what's really nice is that it's not so much about the character. This is written in third person. And it says she needed this. So something has happened to her that we don't know about. And so it's an effective placing of that single line paragraph because we kind of learn that for whatever reason, she needed this. But we are ultimately left in the dark about this character. So the use of that paragraph there has been cleverly thought out. It's not just throwing a one sentence paragraph in there. Purpose is to create mystery around this character, so it's used purposefully. Then as the writing continues, you've got this real focus on her drawing. And the pace really slows here. And there's lots more sort of long, detailed words to slow down the pace as well. Words like tranquility and fragile and slightly. The word calming and these elongated verbs essentially slow down the pace to really kind of show her calmness that kind of overtakes her. So yes, it's a simple action that this character is engaging in, but the description is really developed as well, in the sense that, again, it's showing and not telling. Again, you've got this paragraph, this single sentence paragraph, and again varying sentences with breathe, Emily, breathe. And then you've got this slow zoom with Emily beginning to draw. And structurally it's lovely because it captures the setting as she captures it too with her eyes. So we start off on the surface, the frozen surface, and then the reeds, and then her eyes kind of track to the trees, so we see what she sees. So really nice in terms of structure and tracking what the character's doing, and we see what she sees. And then a lovely simile with the idea of stood like stoic sentinels, some alliteration with painstaking precision, and then again another simile with reaching out like skeletal fingers. So what's really, really lovely about that last bit is that even though we've got that theme of death again, this time it really cleverly creates almost sympathy, because the winter sea in the marshland is almost kind of personified as needing spring and longing for the caress of spring, just like Emily needs it too. So there's this almost kind of unison between them. Very, very clever. The ideas there and the communication there is brilliant in terms of how it slowly communicates what she is seeing and those beautiful language devices used. Now, towards the last little bit, again, her sketchbook is a testament to the marshland's beauty, so she recognises that beauty and has managed to capture that beauty. She's had this epiphany and this understanding, so there's this sense of peace settling within her, and she's even smiling by the end and grateful for that fear. So we've got this resolution, almost this narrative resolution. And then at the end, just to really kind of bolster that structural variation of techniques we've been using, by the end, we've got this marshland remained wrapped in its winter cocoon. So we've got this cyclical structure because it slumbers on, just like we mentioned sleep right at the very, very start of this response. Now, the idea of a cocoon is a little bit different to the start, though, as obviously it is still talking about sleep, but it just seems a lot more peaceful and vulnerable and delicate with the cocoon. It's almost like more protective. So it seems a lot sweeter and more gentle compared to the beginning. So there's a lot more peace within the final stages of this response. Now I'm going to show you on the next slide how this piece gets the marks. Obviously I've shown you some of the features that we've spotted, the structure, the paragraphs, the language devices, the vocabulary that we've used. So let's just look at the mark schemes to decide on a mark, and then we are done. Okay, so in AO5, don't forget there are 24 marks available. Let's just tick off what we can see. Now we've got the communication is persuasive and engaging. Certainly, it kind of leads us into this sense of danger, and then there's this epiphany and it just completely shifts. The communication makes perfect sense. There's nothing too difficult to communicate either in terms of the tragedies that I told you to avoid earlier. So we've certainly got that one, we can give that a tick. The second bullet point was about tone, style and register, suiting the target audience, so we can definitely tick that one. Rich and bold vocabulary coupled with consistent use of language techniques. There are so many amazing words used throughout, along with a real variation in language devices as well, so certainly we can tick that one. You can look back at those slides to see where we've annotated those. We look at organisation. We've got creative and diverse application of structural elements. I think I must have mentioned structure a million times over those past two slides. It's really, really brilliantly considered in a really, really creative, unique way. So absolutely that one gets a tick. Composition is captivating, featuring a spectrum or a range of intricate and persuasive concepts, definitely. Some of the ideas are really, really complex, and that makes it captivating. Intricacy of it, the careful thought of it in terms of the structure we keep mentioning, certainly. So it's captivating in the sense that it's just cleverly put together. And then finally, we've got smoothly connected paragraphs enriched by effortlessly blended discourse indicators. So throughout it flows really well. We can see the movement of the character tracked with varying paragraphs, and where there's stillness and where there's a change in focus, whether that's the setting or her and what she's doing and the fear that she feels. So we can absolutely tick that one as well. So that gives that a total of 24 so far, which is a full mark response in terms of AO5. Finally, looking at AO6, we've got 60 marks available and 6 bullet points to check over. So just with the response first and foremost, 100% there are technical abilities that are accurately kind of sustained throughout the piece of writing. It's clear that sentences are used well, vocabulary is spelt correctly. Not only that, but vocabulary is ambitious as well. The grammatical structures are perfect in terms of sentence variations. There's lots of different sentence types as well. They're used for effect. I would say the only one that's really missing is a broad spectrum of punctuation. So we can tick off these as we go, just so I can show you what I mean. Sentence boundaries are consistently defined and consistently precise. There are no accuracies in terms of sentence boundaries where they're being marked off, so we can tick that one. Employs a comprehensive array of sentence styles for effect. Yes. There's a huge range throughout, kind of pointed them out as we went. Consistently and aptly employs standard English with a firm grasp of grammatical constructs. Certainly there are no grammatical errors, as we said. Spelling, brilliant, with challenging vocabulary choices too. Yes. An expansive and bold vocabulary use. Now what's really nice about this one is that double marked, so we've got vocabulary on the left there, third bullet point under AO5, and then this bullet point here on AO6. So amazing to vary your vocabulary, and that the best way to kind of achieve that is by reading, because you will be inspired and see how words are applied in other people's work. So please read, that will definitely help with that, and it's worth it for that kind of double mark. So subtracting that punctuation bullet point, because I would put that in level 3 in terms of just varying punctuation a little bit more throughout that piece of writing, we've got 15 out of 16. So in total we have got 39 out of 40, which is a brilliant mark. So feel free to keep this response just as a really, really lovely model example.
Well done, lovelies, for making it to the end of this paper. This was quite a long one, but hopefully you're starting to see with all of these videos the skills that you can use and apply in your exam.